Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Holistic Pharmacy Podcast. I have a very special guest as usual for you all today. His name is Dr. Jeffery A. Johnson. I hope I got that right. And he has a very interesting story about why he had to differentiate his name that I hope he'll get into. But just to introduce him briefly, he's a combat 30-year veteran U.S. Armed Forces, and he graduated BS-Pharm in Purdue. He also earned his naturopathic doctor license, and he's a PharmD as well. And he spent 30 plus years educating and consulting both fellow healthcare professionals as well as interested clients on the benefits and potential challenges of the employment of nutraceuticals as a viable adjunct to personal healthcare needs. Right now, he is post-retiring, and he's used these past 8 years to continue this journey of educating and consulting in regards to nutraceuticals, as well as overall good healthcare practices. So without further ado, Dr. Jeffery, welcome.
Thank you, Marina. And it's a pleasure to have you guys give me an opportunity just to talk. As my lovely bride of 47 years, Cindy, would tell you, I'm usually very shy and withdrawn, and I don't do these kind of things, which that's not true. But anyway, we'll drive on. It's really exciting to be with you guys, and I hope I can share some enlightenment, and we'll drive on from there.
Yeah, well, you have such an interesting background, and you've gotten yourself involved in a lot of different things. So I'm curious if you could shed some insight as to what got you into the armed forces and then into medicine.
Well, that's great. Well, first off, a lot of that lays on my dad, because my dad was a World War II veteran. He was a Pearl Harbor survivor. And as growing up with my pop, he, and I always called him Pops, Pops was very, very supportive, very, very patriotic. And I saw that growing up. So finally, when I was getting ready to graduate from high school, I talked to Dad about maybe joining the armed forces. And so I waited a while. I got through pharmacy school, and I joined the Army National Guard in Indiana. And I did that for 5 years. And then after that, I decided, one, I looked better in blue, and two, I got tired of sleeping on the ground. So I switched to the Air Force, and I did 25 years in the Air Force. And so as a pharmaceutical care provider in the Air Force, as some of my Air Force brothers and sisters out there will tell you, we have a huge opportunity to do multidisciplinary work. And that was one of the things that really attracted me, because I did civilian pharmacy for a short while while I was in the Guard. And I really did not feel like I had as much impact as the opportunities offered me in the Air Force. And so that's one reason I did that. But then as far as why I got into the nutraceutical realm and the dietary supplements and herbals, was that when I was stationed in Alaska, and this was from 1992 to 94, I just completed my MBA. And I was looking for another challenge. And one of the things that struck me was going into nutraceuticals and becoming an herbal or a naturopath. And that really fascinated me. And I started into that and did my degree in naturopathy. And once I got that done, I thought, as a pharmacist, for doctors and fellow pharmacists and other healthcare providers to take us seriously, I thought it would be adds to credibility if I had my PharmD. So I went to the University of Kansas on an online program and finished my PharmD with that. And so that's kind of how that got me going, because at that point, and Marina, you know this very well, back in the early 90s, we were looking at a nutraceutical market of only about $9 million. But you look at it today and it's up to $90 billion. And I saw that wave coming. And what I thought was, well, as pharmacists, because we're one of the most accessible healthcare providers, our patients are going to come to us and they're going to say, what do you think about this stuff? And for us, and no offense to any of our academia folks out there, but we don't focus on that aspect of pharmacy very much. And so that's where us, as both pharmacists and as herbalists, I think it behooves us to try to educate our fellow healthcare providers. And that's not just pharmacists, but that's all of us. That's that multidisciplinary aspect. So that's one reason I got into that. And so I'll tell a quick funny story. One of my assignments was the chief of pharmacy training, which at that time for Air Force pharmacy training, which was stationed at Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas. And as I got that job, I had really been doing a lot of work on doing education on nutraceuticals. And I'll never forget that my boss, her name will remain nameless because she may be listening, reminded me that I wasn't there to teach herbals. I was there to teach pharmacy. So, but I was successful in adding one little block of training on dietary supplements and nutraceuticals. So it was kind of fun. But I did not disobey her. I wasn't there to teach dietary supplements. I was there to teach pharmacy, and that's what I did. But I was able to slip that into the regime of study. So that's kind of how I got into it, and that has been a mainstay. In fact, I always kind of like to say I was, and I think I still am, the only active duty herbal pharmacist that ever served in the armed forces. Now, that's a bold claim, and you may have somebody come back and say, I know something about Colonel Johnson. That's not necessarily true, but go for it.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Johnson, it sounds like you have a diverse background and definitely have added a ton of credibility to your work by getting the additional degrees that I feel like many people even today don't go out and get, a second master's or another doctorate degree after they already have a professional license or degree of some sort. So I have to commend you because it's a lot of effort. It's a lot of funds, right? It's a lot of time to get all of that on board. And it does add to your expertise. And whenever you are in a space where other people have degrees and licenses, it gives you a voice, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So
absolutely.
I really, really appreciate that. And I think what you're speaking to as far as why you got that additional licensure or degrees or titles is to add to your scope of practice as well.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
And even the reason you got into the military space. So I'm curious if you could share with us, for many listeners that may not know what the difference is and what the difference in scope may be, and that attracted you and allowed you to practice at the top of your license in the military. Could you tell us what that is?
Sure. So what's interesting is, let me do it like a Lego block, and I'll start at the very beginning, because our basic pharmacists within the military, they're just very, very similar to what we have on the civilian side. They're a pharmacist. I mean, their primary job. Now, one of the most significant differences between a civilian pharmacist and a military pharmacist is that our pharmacy technicians, which that's what I was in charge of training those for one period, they have a lot more scope of care in the military than we do on the civilian side. So for me to do my job as a military pharmacist, my pharmacy technicians work closely, shoulder to shoulder with me. So in a lot of cases, as everyone knows, and I don't want to get too basic, but we know that there's basically 7 steps in filling prescriptions. My pharmacy technicians, which were very, very well trained in the Air Force and the Army as well as the Navy and the other branches, so I don't want to slight anybody, but they're very, very well trained. And so they would pretty much handle 6 of the 7 steps. And the 7th step of the pharmacist being the final checker, even though we did have some senior technicians that were qualified under the pharmacist to do additional checking with you. That really helped me as a clinician have that ability to go out and work more with the multidisciplinary docs, nurses, nutritionists, whoever you want to mention. And that really helped because I could trust that my pharmacy technicians were taking care of business, and they didn't need me to be standing there staring over their shoulder, because I knew they were well trained. So that's what you basically see. But then as you go up the line as a pharmacist and you become more senior, you really do start to get more involved on the clinical side of the house. And so, like, for example, pharmacists run clinics. So we have those in the military. And of course, that again depends on our technicians to be taking care of the dispensing function as we're taking care of the clinical function. But I think it's critical for we as pharmacists to understand that dispensing function, because for us to trust that our technicians are doing it properly, we have to understand what they're doing. So that was kind of that basics that I got started with. But as I moved up the line from captain to major, major to lieutenant colonel to colonel, it became more obvious that and clear that I needed to be more engaged on the clinical side of the house. And that's okay, because I knew my techs were taking care of the dispensing side. And so that's what started to happen. And then as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons I wanted to see how we could better integrate traditional medication within the military space was that as a combat pharmacist, one of the things that I saw was that sometimes due to the supply chain, you may find yourself where you're not able to get the conventional medication just due to supplies. So you may have to look at, are there ways for us to use traditional ones in place of that? And that, again, as you were mentioning, that kind of helped my credibility to say, look, the reason I think we need to have, let's just say garlic, using garlic as a adjunct to antibiotic therapy. We know garlic has alicillin in it. Alicillin is very, very closely related to penicillin. Therefore, we know that garlic has some antibiotic properties. Any herbalist, and Marina, I know you know this to be true, we understand that there's that line of demarcation that there may be things we can say that are adjunct, but we also know that there are things that a herbal may not necessarily be able to treat on its own. And having that conventional component really makes sense. And that's where that integration starts to come in. So as a degreed pharmacist, as a degreed herbalist, and with that background going on, it really did help me explain to providers and the whole healthcare provider realm of why I think adding one of those supplements would be a good thing, a nutraceutical. And I think that really is done. And so as I've gone along in my career, and now being on this side of being retired, even though I no longer wear the uniform, I still am very supportive of what's going on within our armed forces. It still helps for me to be able to reach out to my network and say, hey, here's where I think these new products might be. These products, even though they may be new to the market, they may be really old and they've been around for a long time, how they can integrate into that traditional conventional space. Does that make sense? And so that's kind of where that happens. And so the big change between what I see in civilian pharmacy and military pharmacy is that because of how our military pharmacy system has been developed, the pharmacist actually has a lot of opportunity to interact with the clinical side of the house and not be overly concerned about the dispensing side. We still need to be concerned because that's part of our realm. But knowing that we have that trusted system of senior technicians, handling that, it really frees us up. Does that make a lot of sense? I hope it does.
Yeah. And just like one more point on this, who are the population that you're treating, and what kind of care are you providing both in the pharmacy space and also in the multidisciplinary team? Yes. And how do you all interact?
Yeah. So this is where, in a lot of ways, the military population is very, very mirroring the civilian population, because we're dealing with all the very similar scenarios that our civilian population is caring for. So diabetics, and used to, when I first joined the military, if you had diabetes, you could not belong. But we've come that way with new technologies and new medications that are diabetic, controlled diabetic is very, very, very similar to everybody else. And so as long as you're doing that, and that's one of those populations. Asthmatics used to, again, asthmatics could not deploy, because if you think about it, in a deployed situation, let's just use the Middle East, you're in a very dusty environment. So for an asthmatic, that could be very problematic. Whereas now with some of the new medications we have, treating an asthmatic, we can get them through that. And so we see a lot of they are very, very, very same disease states that we're seeing within the civilian population and the military population. I will add one of the things now, we'll get through this a little bit more, but one of the things I'm working with right now with one of my clients, one of my consulting clients, the company is called iHealth, and they have a product line called Azo. And Azo is really, and I know a lot of the older pharmacists out there, and in fact, you're not an older pharmacist, Marina, but I know you know it. The Azo product line is really focused on urinary tract infections and vaginal tract infections. But one of the things that's really fascinating is that I just read a study just yesterday that was done in 2003 at looking at the prevalence of UTIs and VTIs within a military female population. And what they found was, and again, this is 2003 numbers, so my guess would be it's a little bit higher today in 2025, was that 30% of the female troop population would suffer at some point in time with a urinary tract or vaginal tract infection. Now, is that a big deal? Well, especially today, since we have more of our female troops in a combat role, it could be, because there's a thing called disease non-battle injury. Okay, so that's you got to excuse me, I love acronyms. That's an NDBI. Okay, so a disease non-battle injury can effectively take a troop out of their ability to do their combat role. So if you have a unit, let's just say it's 10 people, and you have 30% of those that can't function because they have a urinary tract infection, that reduces them down to 70% that can do their job in combat. Well, that becomes what we call combat ineffective, because if they're down to only 70% of their people and they're going to get into, let's unfortunately say, a firefight, if they lose one more person or two more people, they're down to 50% and they're not able to do their job. So that's where, for me, as a consultant, I want to consult the higher ups to say, look, we may be able to prevent that 30% by using traditional medications, i.e. like azo, to help prevent that from happening. And even to the point of, with some of the testing that come through the azo product line and those kind of things, that the troop could have an early warning that they're developing a UTI or VTI and treat it before it gets bad. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the areas I find myself in. And I get really excited about that, if you can't tell, because I think that's one of those things that as pharmacists, especially as military pharmacists, that we want to try. We say, we have a phrase for the medics in the military is, we serve that others may live. And that's one of those things that we love to do. And that's part of what I try to do as a consultant, is try to help them have a better awareness of things that are out there, traditional medications, that nutraceuticals, that would be a very positive adjunct to the conventional.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the concept of scope of practice is so important, obviously, as a way to delineate and stay in our lanes, number one. And also, legally speaking, we have earned a license or the ability to practice in a certain way.
Yes.
But I think when it comes to pharmacy practice, when we actually look at the law, there could be some leeway in interpreting what our scope allows us to do, and yet we're not granted provider status, right?
Right.
And so there's a number of advocacy happening on that front, but specifically in the recommending a therapy, right? A therapeutic agent, we cannot prescribe it. We cannot prescribe something that's prescription designated, right? Or diagnose. We can diagnose somebody. However, when it comes to dispensing or being in a retail pharmacy setting, right, civilian or military or what have you, or any other type of pharmacy setting, there's nothing preventing us from educating and making a recommendation on self-care. This is kind of under our consulting as a pharmacist. And every time somebody picks up a medication, we actually have the ability and also the right to, and we're expected to do a consultation, right? This is definitely under our scope. And now there's different state restrictions with some of the things that we are able to counsel on, but this is an essential pharmacist skill. So
absolutely.
A lot of times that can incorporate lifestyle changes, dietary changes that you would do in addition to taking a medication, because we know if you're prescribed something for asthma or for diabetes, we understand the pathology. We understand what are the other things that have to be done, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So why are we not consulting more and counseling more on those areas which medicine says they are the, step 0, 1, and 2, they still have to be done, not just jumping to a drug or a surgery or something like that. And even if you have to add it, you still shouldn't be skipping steps, 0 through 3, right? Let's say.
Yes.
And so when an herb or a natural substance or supplement, or even if we can combine herbs as a spectrum of food, right?
Right.
because they're a food substance.
Right.
Sometimes it goes more in the spectrum of food. Sometimes it goes into the spectrum of medicine and
Yes.
becoming
Yeah.
a little bit more narrow therapeutic index, right?
Yes. Yes.
So how come, other countries, and I've visited a lot, I am from another country, and I understand that pharmacy practice is different in other countries. A lot of times those pharmacists are trained on natural medicine,
Yes.
or that is part of the scope, or that is part of the retail setting. And here we have only specialty pharmacists that seem to have to have additional training that's not included in their pharmacy practice or schooling rather. And we kind of have to wing it and research it on our own or take additional degrees in order to become experts in this space. So why do you think that is?
Well, and Marina, that's an awesome question. And I'll tell you, first off, I'm going to compliment you because, you and I connected on a podcast that you did probably close to a year ago. And it was talking about the microbiome, and the pharmacist that was talking about that was fascinating. And that rejuvenated my interest. I mean, I've never lost it, and I've continued through my consulting to try to do it as best I can. But as you well know, unfortunately, in the American healthcare system, nutraceuticals and traditional practice have kind of taken a far back seat in the bus. Whereas I think one of the things you're doing, which again I compliment you, and I'm gonna put a plug in for your podcast today at 3:00, even though no one's going to hear it until 3 months later. But doing the Herbal Academy and allowing those folks to have that platform, to utilize your platform to do those kind of things, those are one of the ways we start to change that narrative of us being in the back of the bus. Doesn't mean we need to be in the front of the bus. I mean, I'd be happy with the second or third seat, but having that opportunity and doing these kind of things are one of the ways we start to change that. The second way is one of the countries that just amazes me of how much they use nutraceuticals is Germany, because that is part of their national formula. And again, I think that's one of those ones as healthcare providers. And even though you and I, as herbal pharmacists, aren't considered that within the American healthcare system, we are. And there it is, we are. So we continue to do that and present ourselves in those venues in that light. Eventually, sooner or later, they're going to say, okay, fine, here we go. It kind of reminds me of when I first got into the military, that PAs, physician assistants, and nurse practitioners were not considered providers at the time. Now, PAs and nurse practitioners have continued to fight that fight and finally are recognized as providers. We have to do the same thing. We have to take a page out of their playbook and continue to fight for that. And we are. And that's part of what's going on right now, is with us doing these kind of things. And you know as well as I do that there are other healthcare providers that tune into your podcast and listen to what's going on. They may not be vocal at this point, but sooner or later they will be. And we know as pharmacists, when you look at what I call the four-legged healthcare stool, we are part of that. And you've got your patient, your provider, us, and then of course you got to remember logistics, because logistics is critical. Because if we can't get the product, then we can't use it. But you made a really good point about how we know, as at this current time, there are some states that give us minor prescriptive opportunities. We did that in the Air Force. There are some things, and it depends base to base. From a policy perspective, most of the time within the Air Force regulations or whatever branch you want to look at, pharmacists are not given that prescriptive ability. But as we have started standing up pharmacist-run clinics, they have given us limited prescriptive ability, which is that's a good step. And we just have to continue to do that. We know within our scope as consulting with our patients or with fellow providers, we can do recommendations. And I make it clear whenever either I consult a client or consult a potential patient that I cannot prescribe. What I'm sharing with them is recommendations, and that they should really try to discern that. I'll give them as much information as I can. I will also say, if you want to go back to your primary healthcare provider and have us do a consultation with each other, more than happy to do that. And I think that's one of those ways, again, that we continue to do that. But I think you're absolutely right. It's, on the one hand, it's kind of sad that as pharmacists, we're not given the same I don't want to call it respect necessarily, but I think that's kind of along the line, the same understand. I'll use understanding. I think that's better as a healthcare provider, because we are part of the healthcare provider team and we are healthcare providers in our own right. And so I think having that understanding is, it would go a long way in helping the patient, overall helping the patient, because that's what we're really all in the business for, is to help the patient.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I'm more than happy to stay in my lane, so to speak, and
Mm-hmm.
not have prescriptive authority at all. However, I do think that as a healthcare team player, we should all have the ability to educate one another and our patients
Yes.
on the topics that I mentioned before: lifestyle, diet,
Yes.
herbs, alternative therapy, standard
Yes.
conventional therapy, and I think it fits into everybody's scope to do that. And even as a prescriber, there's nothing to force the patient on acting on that prescription and going to fill it. I think at
Right.
the end of the day, we're all in this. We know this is
Yes.
all risk versus benefit,
Yes.
and
Yes.
we don't have all the answers. We
Yeah.
study as much as we can, right?
Yes.
And I think just listening to one another and our expertise is key, and it's an
Yeah.
asset. I don't think it should be seen as a threat. I think it should be
No.
seen as an asset.
Yes. And you just said a really key word there. We are not a threat. My first presentation I ever did on nutraceuticals was in Alaska, in Anchorage, Alaska. I was a young captain with the Air Force at the time. I got approval from my commander to do this presentation. It was to a group of nurses. And so, that was very interesting because it was my very first ever presentation on nutraceuticals. And I can tell you, I was nervous as a cat on a hot tin roof, because it just was like, oh my goodness, how am I going to present myself? But it was really good. And from there, I've continued to be able to present to fellow providers, not just pharmacy, about what goes on when we're trying to integrate traditional medications with conventional medications. So that's really been exciting. And I think you just nailed it. I mean, we just have to continue to put that word out there. And as you well know, Marina, because you are one as yourself, we have to find influencers that can help us along that pathway. In fact, one of the things I'm excited here in the next couple of weeks, I'll be talking to two pharmacists I got to hear present at AMSIS, and AMSIS or EPJ, either one, it doesn't matter. But these two young pharmacists are really working within sports medicine. And as they were doing their presentation, it was fascinating, because one of the things they kept talking about was, as they've gotten into sports medicine as pharmacists, is they're helping athletes identify what both traditional and conventional ways can they enhance their performance without getting themselves in trouble. So they're looking at that. And it was really interesting, because one of the things they talked about was, one of the things they counsel with their athletes is, there are certain products that could affect them in a negative way and make them unable to participate in their sport. Okay. Well, for me as a Air Force pharmacist, one of the things we look at, we call it DNIF. And what a DNIF is, it means that you're not able to fly, or if you're a security forces, you're not able to carry a weapon, because whatever it was you took could affect your overall mental capability at that point. And so it was fascinating to listen and talk to it. So I went up and talked to him afterwards and said, look, what you're talking about is, I know there's tons of research in the Air Force that talks about a very similar thing, where you're talking about they can't participate in their sport. I'm talking about the pilot can't fly. And so that was really fascinating. So we made a link with that. And so we're going to have a discussion here in a couple of weeks along that further line, because I'm hoping possibly we can do some joint research on the comparison between an athlete unable to do their job and a pilot or security forces, even an Army ground pounder, being able to carry a weapon because of something they took. So it's kind of fascinating stuff. But that's the kind of thing we have to find as well. And you know that. We just have to find those areas that we can join in and say, hey, let me bring my expertise to the table and help you see a little bit broader viewpoint of what you're already looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have so many skills that we learn as pharmacists that we can transfer it in a lot of unique and amazing ways. And
Yes.
I really love seeing what other pharmacists are doing. A lot of them are on this show. So I am really, really looking forward to continuing to see people's advances and how they push our degree and our profession forward. Now, we talked a little bit about how scope can be a little bit problematic in integrating, right, in this traditional and conventional model. Now, the other thing that I personally see as a big, big problem is the business model of healthcare, where we have payers and they're the biggest players as far as what actually gets pushed forward. And then we have the pharmaceutical companies that are naming the prices, right? And then having contract with those payers. And then it has a way to get dispensed and retailed, and there's coupons and there's back end deals and things like this. And it just makes it very, very confusing. And that also doesn't allow a person to have full agency of what prescription or recommendation they would like to follow through with if money's involved, right? And if something's not covered, something is not a prescriptive item, something's not on formulary. All of these are different challenges. And what do you see as one of the biggest challenges in having a more integrated model?
So that's a great question. I'm going to share a real quick story. So I was a civilian pharmacist for about 8 years. Had my own pharmacy with a fellow pharmacist for a couple years. And one of the things that got so frustrating for me, and it's one reason I finally went back into the military and went to work for the VA for a short while, was that the third-party payer. I got so frustrated with that because, as you well know, when they're only going to give you $1.50 to $2 or $2.50 for your pharmacy skills, you're going, but I'm worth more than that. And the patient gets more from me than $1.50 per prescription or $2 or whatever it is now. I mean, that's craziness. And that really frustrated me. And that's one reason I finally, I found myself very comfortable within the VA and military space, because I didn't have to worry about that. That's on the administration side. If they want to try and collect from Medicare, Medicaid, whatever, I don't care. It's not me having to do that. And that may have been a infantile way to get away from it, but it worked, because I did it for 30 years and didn't have to worry about that. Now, today, unfortunately, I think my military pharmacists are kind of having to deal with it these days. Not to the extent we did as civilian pharmacists, but still, they're dealing with that. So anyway, to get back to your question, I think, and I will say one more thing. What's interesting is I've gone to APHA's, American Pharmacists Association's meeting, oh gosh, probably once. I think I only missed like 5 or 6 in the past 40 years. And so what's interesting is what they were talking about 40 years ago of us getting paid as pharmacists for what we do as healthcare providers. They're still talking about the same thing. I mean, this last meeting I had which is just in March of 25, still talking the same thing. And it's fascinating to me to think, okay, you guys have been talking about this now for almost 50 years and nothing has changed. So to me, and I'm not bashing on APHA, but at the same time, it's like, we clearly haven't found the key yet to open that door to get that going. I mean, there is some positive movement along that line. But again, I think it's very similar to what you asked earlier, Marina, is that we just have to continue to thump that drum and say, look, we bring a lot to the table. One of the things I've always told young pharmacists that I've interviewed to come into the military is the fact that we have such an opportunity, but we have to beat the drum. We can't just sit behind the pharmacy counter and count, lick, and stick and hand it out the window and think that's going to change things. We have to be the ones that stand up and say, oh, by the way, I can do that. And that's what I've seen. I mean, I know some pharmacists within the Air Force system that are doing some phenomenal, not just Air Force, across the DoD, that are doing some phenomenal non-traditional pharmacy jobs. They're not pharmacy jobs, but they're doing them as pharmacists because of the skill set that we bring to bear on them, not just within the clinical realm, but also within the business administration realm, because we understand that. One young pharmacist, a young captain commander, who I had a conversation with a couple of weeks ago, he's doing a job that you would never think a pharmacist would do. But the reason she got hired for that is because she's a problem solver. And that's what we pharmacists do. We solve problems. And she's able to take that skill that she's developed as a pharmacist and apply it to a much broader, significant scope. I can't go into details because it's a classified mission, but it's phenomenal to see what she's doing. I mean, she got me fired up. I was almost ready to call my recruiter back and say, "Hey, I want to come back in." I can't. I'm too old, but that's beside the point. But it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective on this. And I'm going to give a shout out to one of my friends, Dr. Lauren Castle, who is a leader in the functional pharmacy space, that talks about her own experience wanting to bring in a more integrative model into a big retailer, and then being told that this is a direct competition with their existing model, right? When we are optimizing patient care with cheaper, available, sustainable models through diet and lifestyle and herbs, this cuts down perhaps and deprescribes their medications and lessens the volume of prescriptions that we're now filling for this population, which is in direct detriment to such a business model. And this goes exactly with us not getting paid for our consulting or counseling services, right? And just getting the dispensing fees. And we've been talking about that as well, what we're actually charging our fees for. So where do you see us going with this? How do we solve this and continue to create this integrative care?
And I think that's a really, really good segue, because I think, and I'm going to call it MedCon Recon. Now, what I'm talking about there is medication reconciliation. And I really think for us that model of medication reconciliation, MedCon Recon, is one of the pillars in our pushing forward on this. I really do. I think it's, as I love to call the Army, likes to talk about the long pole in the tent. I think that's what that is. That's the long pole in the tent. Because with medication reconciliation, if a organization, whether it be a retail pharmacy or big pharma or whoever, even an HMO, if they truly are there for the care of the patient and making sure that the patient is living the best lifestyle they can with the medications they're having to take for whatever their medical condition is, then medication reconciliation is that area you have to focus on. And as you well know, as a fellow pharmacist, if we can reduce the amount of medications they have to take, one, the patient's going to be much happier because they don't have to take as much. And we know that's part of where MedCon Recon comes in, because let's just take hypertension. You're taking one medication for hypertension, but it has a side effect. So you add another medication to take care of the side effect. Well, but that one has a side effect too. So you add another one, and it just goes on and on and on. It's a downward spiral. Whereas as a MedCon Recon specialist, if we can look at that and say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at this again. In fact, let's just do a drug holiday for a week and come back and reevaluate what we really need to try to do to get you on the right regimen of medications. I'll give you an example. When I was the chief of pharmacy at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City, and I had a young pharmacist and this was just when medication reconciliation was really starting to ramp up. And I tell you what, this kid was awesome. We had a husband and wife, retirees, that the husband was taking 55 different medications. The wife was taking 60. Yeah. He got them down to 20 each. Now, 20 is still a lot, but still to go from 55 and 60 down to 20. And they came in after, and it took him about 3 months to finally wean them down to just those 20. And they both, now what's interesting is, they say, I don't know if you have pets or not, Marina, but they say we start to look like our pets, or our pets start to look like us.
Right.
Well, I think it's kind of true with husbands and wife. You start to resemble each other. And it was fascinating because he had 55 medications, she had 60. She had the same 55 he had, but 5 additional. And I don't know, and again, I can't remember the specifics. Yeah, it's crazy. But after 3 months, and he got them down to those 20 each, it was fascinating to see how they changed, because they went from being sluggish and just it was crazy. But it got down to the point where you could tell they had changed. They felt better, they looked better, and they weren't taking as much medication. So medication reconciliation, I think, has a huge impact, and I think that's where we have to continue to push that concept, because that's the big dog in the fight for us, because that's what we do. We do medication reconciliation, and the advantage of an herbal pharmacist doing it is the fact that we may see things that we can use from a traditional aspect to replace some of those other medications. Does that make sense? And I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I asked you that question, because I wanted to segue about the potential for herbal medicine and nutraceuticals to
Yes.
fill in some of these gaps in a
Yes.
very cost-effective and sustainable way.
Yes.
And also very accessible, right? Like you mentioned, the
Yes.
supply chain issues. And just hearing you share that story about the 55 plus meds, I think it just goes to show that we should probably be a little bit more conservative with our prescriptive authorities, whoever is, putting that many medications on board. And there could be multiple providers that could contribute to this polypharmacy too. And we, as the central filling place, dispensing place, have privy to that information that the providers may not even know, right? And then the second thing is, I think it's unethical, right, to practice medicine in this way and not to get to the root causes and not to see right away how do we minimize the treatment plan at every single step of the way. Why wait till MedRec when it should be at every visit?
Yes, absolutely. I have to tell you, there was a pharmacist. It was the last session I went to at APHA this year, and he's an herbal pharmacist out of California. I won't mention his name because that's inappropriate, and I don't have the authority or the permission to do that. But he's been practicing. He's been practicing herbal, so traditional, conventional pharmacy now for over 40 years, and I was just fascinated by him. And the one comment he made that really just slammed home with me was, he said, "Do you guys," and we're all pharmacists, well, most of us, we're pharmacists sitting in the room, pharmacists, pharmacy techs. He says, "Do you guys, can you tell me what's the one medication we dispense that cures? It's the only one we dispense that cures." And of course, everybody said, and finally someone said, "Antibiotics." He goes, "Exactly. That is the only medication we dispense that's a curative. All the rest of them are symptomatic." And that's true. I mean, we may want to think it's different, but it isn't. So it's the same kind of with our traditional meds, with herbals and nutraceuticals. There's none of them that necessarily cure, but they are preventative. They are very, very preventative. And we can start the laundry list of things that are quercetin, which is one of the things I discovered back in 2018. Quercetin is very, very preventative. And it's fascinating to see how it works. And of course, one of the things, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but I'm going to. We sit there and we get, well, you don't have enough research. You don't have enough research on the nutraceuticals and herbals. Well, that's not necessarily true. Now, they may not be as broad in scope as what some of the conventional research projects have done, but that's when you start doing meta-analysis to try to compare them so that you can make them such that it's not that you're trying to mold the data. You are looking at them from a very scientific procedure process, but there has been plenty of research. So anyway, but yeah, I think that's one of the things that we can really do and be very helpful for our patients and for our fellow providers. Look, we're not just blowing smoke at you. We know that there's only one thing we give that cures, and that's an antibiotic. The rest of them are adjuncts. However, within the nutraceutical and herbal realm, there are some that are even better adjuncts than the other ones.
Absolutely. And I will add on to that as well. When I was thinking about doing a residency, I think one of the things that attracted me to infectious diseases was the same concept that, yes, you have to just do the workup, identify the organism, and then you have a solution and it's short term and you fix the acute issue and you're done. However, I think that's simplistic and wishful thinking. And now that we are seeing the effects of pretty much a century's worth of antibiotics, we're seeing that there's resistance. There's MDR, multiple drug resistance. We're seeing that the bacteria are fighting back and mutating at a much faster rate than our scientific tools can come up with ways to combat them and create new drugs that would have broader scopes, right? And we're also harming the microbiome. We were talking about the importance of that earlier. So we're not just specific. Sometimes we can be a little bit specific and sensitive to the bacteria that we're targeting or the organism. However, we have a long way to go, let's just say that, and we're running out of time because the infections are becoming greater and greater and our tools are just not measuring up. And so this is where I think the herbals and other natural remedies can actually come in and, like you said, be better adjuncts that rather than piling more and more antibiotic or other kinds of therapy, because number one, they're failing, and number two, these things, the whole plant foods and herbs they have different mechanisms that are synergistics, and they can evade those drug resistance pathways because they're attacking from different angles. And they're also usually not harming the body at the same time. So we need to build up and support the body as well as target the organisms, which conventional medicine misses.
I mentioned it to you in our pre-talk. I'm just going to show the book so people can see it. Dr. Emmerin Mayer, he's from Southern California, and I got to hear him do a presentation at APHA. He was a product theater. And it was just fascinating. And his whole point, and if you get a chance to read this book, it's called The Mind-Gut Immune Connection. He really has focused on the microbiome of the gut and how it has such a amazing impact on our system, not just the positive, but also could have on the disease side. Because as you were just saying, Maria, when, for example, with overprescribing of antibiotics, we've really screwed up the microbiome in the gut, and that's why it becomes so essential. And I'm gonna focus on. He focuses on three kind of probiotics. There's prebiotics, probiotics, and one other one I can't think of. But he really, thank you. He really focuses on the probiotic idea, and then how the strain is so important. But one of the things he talks about, and I never thought about this, because we've talked about it for years. When you take an antibiotic, you should you kill off the good flora, and you need to work on bringing the good flora back. And so that's why, like yogurt or acidophilus or whatever you want to use, that helps, that probiotic helps bring that back. And he really, really talks about a lot about that. And I think that's where it's very, for us as pharmacists, that becomes another ability for us to say, because of the overprescribing, we really have damaged the microbiome. So if we can look at ways through the traditional nutraceuticals and herbals to help support that microbiome, that's just critical. And I know that's kind of how we got our start, because the young lady you had on was talking a lot about the microbiome. And I have to be honest, I just didn't understand it at the point. But after hearing Dr. Mayer talk and reading his book, I mean, it really did open my eyes a lot about, oh my gosh, now it makes sense to me why a probiotic, not just for after, now it's not, believe me, it's not a cure-all, but it really does help, because in a sense, it's like, it's kind of like in the military, we do a lot of what we call PT, which is physical training. Well, for me, the probiotic is kind of physical training for my microbiomes, because I'm feeding them something that's positive, and it's going to help them understand that, okay, I'm feeling better, so now I can help you feel better. And that's really kind of exciting stuff, because I think that's where, as pharmacists, we have a little bit more of an opportunity to share with our patients. And you mentioned this earlier, and I'm gonna go back on it. So that, what's the number 1 and 2 things of every disease state? The number 1 and 2 things for therapy, every disease state: diet and PT, diet and physical fitness. It just is, because we know, like, for example, unfortunately, I'm at 71 years old, and I've got bad knees and bad backs from being a stupid kid. And so the best thing for me to do, though, is physical therapy, is to do some form of physical therapy. And I do that. My wife and I both are very, very active. And we know that not only benefits our body, but it benefits our mind, because we know as we get older, especially unfortunately, with patients that have either dementia or Alzheimer's, having that mental acuity, we have to challenge that as much as we can. But it's still diet and exercise, diet and exercise. That's the number one, too. And you said that earlier. And I started to jump on it then, but I'll jump on it because it's so important. It's so important. And those are things that we can recommend as pharmacists that are very easy. We can make those recommendations. Dr. Mayer, one of the things he talks a lot about, and I hadn't thought about this, but he really talks a lot about how if you look at the Mediterranean diet, which was primarily fruits and vegetables, very lean meat, which is primarily either chicken or fish, fowl or fish, and avoiding as much as possible, avoiding red meat. Well, we know that's true. We know that in the American diet. Unfortunately, in the American diet, or what he calls the Western diet, it's really focused so much on processed foods, on fast food, on convenience food. Well, we know those are full of empty calories, and they don't nourish our microbiome. So exciting stuff, kid. Exciting.
Yeah, I love the points that you've been making about how fast and convenient doesn't mean optimal, right? It's very different concepts, and often they are opposites. And also how you said about the mind-body connection, that's something we didn't really touch on, but it really is a spectrum as well.
It is.
How one of them supports the other and feeds into the other.
Yes.
And so Dr. Johnson, I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. And if you have just one more minute, I'd love to do a rapid fire round with you.
Yes, I do. Fire away.
Question number one, what's the number one thing people should do to improve their quality of life right now?
The number one thing people can do right now, diet and exercise. One, your diet. Try to focus on, if you don't have a good plan, the Mediterranean diet plan is a good one. Weight Watchers has a beautiful eating program that you can get into. There's several solid ones. The basic thing to stay away from, if you can, definitely stay away from red meat as much as you can. Try to focus on fish and fowl. Try to stay away from processed foods, deep fried foods, those kind of things. I mean, I will say my wife and I go out for date night once a week, and we probably don't eat very healthy on that night. We eat healthy the rest of the week. You just do that. I think that's the number one thing you could do is diet and exercise. And as far as exercise goes, it's cumulative. So one of the things that I do, I call it the I-4-5-5 program. And what that is that at least every 45 minutes, I get up for at least a minimum of 5 to 10 minutes and exercise right here at my desk. I do desk. And if you want more on that, Marina can give you my contact information. I'm more than happy to talk to you about that. And that's free. I'm not going to charge you for a consult. That's free.
Beautiful. What do you wish more people or even pharmacists and healthcare professionals knew about nutraceuticals and herbals?
I guess I wish if I had my one wish, and the good Lord would definitely have that wish, would be that they trust us, that they trust the nutraceuticals, and they trust the healthcare professionals that have gotten involved in those, like yourself and myself, to tell them. And I know, I try to be as discerning as possible. I'm very, very cautious when I'm looking into someone asks me about a nutraceutical or an herbal. I'm very cautious about if I find one that's selling it. That for me is proprietary. That means they're trying to make a buck off of it. I try to look for solid research articles that show that this has been tested to do this, that, and the other. But I really wish that would be where the communication of that there are nutraceuticals and traditional medications that we can trust, and that they would trust us to do that. I would say that would be my number one.
Love that. And then finally, a fun question. What's a hobby or some fun fact you can share with us about yourself?
Oh my goodness. Okay. I play paintball. I've been playing paintball since 1987. And it cracks me up because, one, people say, well, you're playing war. No, it's like tag. You're just using a paintball to tag the other player. And I just find that fascinating. So I'll tell you a really quick funny story on that. So I've been, like I say, I've been playing since 1984, and so now, being 71, I'm probably usually one of the oldest players out on the field. And so one day we were having a scenario game. I play scenario games, and so we're having a scenario game, and the commander said, "Okay." He looks at my squad and says, "You guys are going to run down here. You're going to get this field, set up your perimeter, and we'll be there in a minute." And so I had this young kid, and I said, "Okay, you take this 10 guys, and I'll be right behind you." And so the horn sounds. I mean, they take off like a bullet. I don't run anymore. I walk. So I'm walking. So I finally get up there, and the kid I told to take the crew down there, he goes, "Where you been?" I said, I'm here." He said, "Why didn't you run?" I said, "This is running. Walking is running for me." And he goes, well, what were you doing?" I said, "I was protecting. I was your rear guard. I made sure no one came up behind you." "So did anyone come up behind you?" "No." I said, "Then I did my mission." But that's probably, I love it. I love it.
It's an excellent strategy. So
Yeah.
I can tell you're in the military. All right. So finally, can you please tell people how to reach out to you and learn
Sure.
more about your work?
Yes. So to reach out to me, one, you can contact Marina because she has my email. But my email, the easiest email to get me on is now I'll probably, well, there's two of them. There's Operation Pathfinder 777@gmail.com, and that's all one word, Operation Pathfinders 777@gmail.com. And then my I guess my consultant email is, it's NTRX Path Consultants @outlook.com. So either one of those will get to me, and I'm more than happy to talk with anybody pretty much about anything. But if it's about nutraceuticals or whatever, I'll do my best.
Sounds good. All right. I'll have all that information in the show notes, and I look forward to seeing you again soon, Dr. Jeff.
All right, Marina. Thank you so
Bye.
much. Take care.